As the word reset suggests, the main goal that we should have when it comes to wanting to optimize the function of our nervous system is that we want to work backwards to getting our nervous system to work as it was originally intended to work. And this is how our evolution over thousands of years designed it to work. And what we want to avoid doing, on the other hand, is to get our nervous system to work differently or in a way that we think might be best. And instead, we want to pour all of our efforts into improving the function of the innate and inbuilt systems that are responsible for keeping our body in a state of balance. So if, like me, you believe that the human body was originally built perfectly, but over time it's the experience of physical, chemical, or emotional traumas that disrupt that state of equilibrium, then it's really the undoing of the damage that these things have caused that we really want to focus all of our attention on. It's a little bit like when you decide to buy a new computer or laptop. To begin with, it runs smoothly and quickly, but over time, as you download certain programs, apps, or maybe even the occasional virus, the ability of it to function as it originally functioned becomes hugely impaired, and it starts to slow down, become sluggish, and it struggles to perform the most basic tasks. And that's really what's going on with us humans who experience chronic symptoms, because all of the things that we originally took for granted, like the ability to talk, breathe, digest foods, or even stand up, have been impacted to such an extent that our daily human experience is so far below acceptable standards. So what going backwards involves to metaphorically factory reset our nervous system is to identify the systems and pathways that are responsible for delivering sensory information into our brain, and to find out which of these pathways are hypotonic or just not working as they were originally designed to work, and then training that pathway back to its original and most functional state. Because you see, the activity of organs and blood vessels within the body doesn't work independently from the external environment. And what I mean by this is that it's ultimately external variables that determine how our internal body actually runs. So there'll be an internal neuronal generator that keeps our organs working in a default state. However, once changes about our environment are detected by our body, then this internal default state will change in order to accommodate the change of the environment. So for example, we have receptors in our skin to detect changes in temperature, receptors in our muscles and joints to detect a change in position, receptors in our neck to detect gravitational or pressure changes, receptors in our inner ear to detect changes in head movement, and receptors in our eyes to detect visual stimuli. These receptors are continuously taking on board this sensory information, which then gets converted into a neuronal signal, which is sent to the brain, and then the brain in turn commands an organ to respond in what it deems to be an appropriate manner based on the external stimulus that it's confronted with. And where issues with our nervous system really start to come into play is when the function of one or more of these receptors becomes jeopardized, because all of a sudden they're going to start sending mismatched sensory information into our brain, and in turn our brain isn't going to know how to command the rest of our body to act accordingly. And as a result, we'll end up with timing and coordination issues with the way that our organs function, where their activity might be inappropriately heightened or suppressed. There might also be a fuel surplus or a fuel deficiency based on blood flow alterations, and in the end, the whole body is just going to work completely disjointed. And these numerous adaptations will end up requiring a ton of energy that it will leave you with such little amounts of expendable energy to actually go about your everyday with. But if you did want to understand a little bit more about all of this, I highly recommend checking out the Unbeatable Blueprint online course. Here I'll talk you through exactly how I was able to eventually balance out my own nervous system, and I'll provide you with the precise steps that you need to follow in order to achieve a similar outcome. But what resetting the nervous system ultimately comes down to is training any of these damaged or hypotonic sensory systems back up to a level where they're consistently firing accurate and adequate sensory information into our brain. It's kind of like training a weak muscle at the gym. You know that with a very specifically targeted exercise, you can improve the capabilities of that muscle. However, in the case of the nervous system, it's really the capabilities of these sensory receptors that we really want to train in order to get them back to working as they were originally intended to work. However, one difficulty that arises is that unlike muscles, where you can clearly assess their external tone, most of these sensory receptors are largely internal and hidden away, so knowing which ones to address can be close to impossible, which is the exact reason why I had an extensive neurological examination performed by a trained chiropractic neurologist, because during this examination, he was able to uncover some of these dysfunctions that were hidden away and prescribe me with very targeted exercises in order to correct these dysfunctions. And the impacts that just doing this alone had on my all-round quality of life was simply astronomical. But I won't talk about that too much in this video because I already made a separate 3-hour video documenting the whole experience if you wanted to check that out. But one thing that I think is very important to stress is the fact that this is an incredibly tailored approach to each individual's needs based on the findings from their own examination, which is where I think that all one-size-fits-all approaches fall massively short. For example, if we take brain retraining, meditation, or any other mindset approaches to rewiring the brain, one thing that they all have in common and they all try to leverage is the function of the limbic system in order to calm down processes within the body. But the thing is, the limbic system is part of the basal ganglia, and in order for the basal ganglia to release inhibitory neurotransmitters to calm down the activity of the limbic system, it's entirely dependent upon the information that's fed into it from the cortex. And the ability of the cortex to signal into the basal ganglia is completely reliant upon information that is fed to the cortex, and that information comes from the sensory division of our peripheral nervous system. So simply put, if the sensory receptors that are responsible for decoding our environment were to become dysfunctional, then we're always going to have inaccurate information delivered into our brain, and in turn our brain is going to find it incredibly difficult to gain control over the rest of our body, and no amount of mindset shift is going to be able to take the place of these incredibly specialized receptors. However, once you're able to identify and train these receptors back to a level where they're sending more coordinated sensory information into your brain at an unconscious and ongoing basis, suddenly your whole body starts to calm down, and the feeling that you originally had that your nervous system was dysregulated gradually begins to fade away.